Thank you for joining me on this study of Mark chapter 12. Doing things a little differently, doing it from the sound booth here in church, and I'm hoping in the weeks to come to use this platform because I have opportunities to patch in video feeds, whether that's pictures or other things that I could utilize that'll help as teaching tools. So I'm kind of giving this a trial run to see how it works. But for today, I'm just going to have the scriptures on the presentation. So at least that way I can uh, begin to toy with this technical capability that we have here and hopefully make use of it. Um, and feel free to make comments, give feedback if this is a more beneficial way. I figure that staring at those pictures and passages is certainly better than staring at my mug for the duration of the study. So with no further ado, let's dig into Mark chapter 12. And so hopefully the text will be appearing on your screen right about now. Mark chapter 12, again, the backdrop for Mark is, this passage of Mark, is that Jesus is twice now stated matter-of-factly to his disciples that he is going to Jerusalem and that he will be died there, particularly singling out crucifixion when he teaches his followers to pick up your cross and follow me, clearly laying out the manner in which he will be executed. Now, in the midst of all of this, again, I've been highlighting the consistent conflict that occurs between the religious teachers and so forth and Jesus. And that comes to a head. Jesus in this portion of Mark is going to be the first one to kind of sound off or to fire a warning shot, if you will, across the bow of the Pharisees when he presents a parable. And then you're going to see the Pharisees, teachers of the law, respond to that parable very negatively. So this is an escalating cycle of conflict. And we're going to look particularly here now at what Jesus teaches. He presents his critique as a parable. Mark's gospel, unlike Luke's in particular, doesn't rely too much on parables as a teaching format, but he does draw on this one, and it is a very pointed parable, to say the least. So, read with me. Mark chapter 12, starting the first verse. And he began to speak unto them in parables. I should also mention, before I get too much further along, I did make these slides off of the New American Standard, the NASB, New American Standard Bible. So they're not an NIV as I normally would read. So this has a little bit more of a archaic kind of reading. It's a little more literal in its translation. So if you're wondering what I'm working on, it's the NASB for translation. But anyways, you speak of them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge about it, digged a pit for the winepress and built a tower and lent it out to a husbandman. Now, a husbandman is someone who leases land. It is a tenant, excuse me, more modern English vernacular. And this is not particularly uncommon in the ancient world, much like renting a home is normative in our culture today. In the ancient world, the renting of farmland was a normative practice. Particularly for wealthy landowners who had far more than they were able to oversee and farm themselves. But notice that the landowner does a good job of setting this tenant up for some success. So Jesus, drawing on a normative part of the culture, is going to teach from that platform. I should also mention that being how he, Jesus, is in and around Jerusalem at this time in Mark's gospel, we would do well to remember that a lot of the vineyards, olive groves, and those kinds of things that grew in Israel grew on the hillside in the hill country of Judea. The plains of Galilee were reserved, and along the seashore, reserved more for grain farming. So you'd see Jesus use a parable like a man scattered seeds upon the ground as a parable that would fit when he was preaching and teaching in Galilee, where they'd plant wheat and barley and rye and spelt and other grains. But here, in this instance, Jesus is going to use a vineyard metaphor or illustration for his parable, because he is in the hill country of Judea and in around Jerusalem, where there was a higher concentration of vineyards, olive groves, and the like. And at the season, he sent the husband a servant, that he might receive from the husbandman the fruits of the vineyard. So in the ancient world, if you sublet or leased out a chunk of your farmland to a tenant, it was not an expectation that you would receive back a cash payment, but rather you would receive a share of the crop, of the produce. Now, there are a couple of tactical advantages to a share of a produce. The sharing of produce was more standardized, if you will. So whether you agreed on a 5% or a 10% or whatever the terms of the agreement were for the take of the crop that would go to the landowner, that was set aside, and then that was for their privy. They didn't have to worry about what was fair market value for crops or anything like that. You just gave a percentage. Now, the advantage also of giving a percentage was there was still the incentive for the tenant, the husbandman, if you want to use a more archaic rendering of the Greek, but for the tenant, there was a incentive to do well, because again, if you are going to lose 10, 20, or 30, or whatever percentage of your crop is going to end up going to the landowner, you as tenant wanted to make sure that you grew enough of a crop that it was still worthwhile, that having that loss go to the landowner, you still had something worth having. So it was an incentivized system. It didn't require standardized pricing, which was again an issue in the ancient world, because there's a lot of bartering. There were coins and there were struck coins, as we'll see later on in the passage of Mark 12. But again, in the agricultural world, there was a lot more bartering. In the modern context, farmers still barter back and forth. They might share this tool with that person or that tractor with that neighboring farmer in exchange for use of an implement or those kinds of a thing. But most of it's on a cash basis, and bartering is a smaller portion of how transactions occurred. In the ancient world, it was the opposite. You had far less cash transactions and far more bartering going on. And so this was a normative, again, practice, and Jesus simply draws upon that part of their culture. But in this instance, the parable takes a dramatic turn in the shameful treatment by the tenants of the landowner's servants. It would have been an egregious action to assault the servant of the master, the servant of the landlord, when he was simply trying to collect what was rightfully due him under this system and contract. And so they, reading here a moment, and they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they wounded his head and handled shamefully. And they sent another, and they killed him. And many others, beating some and killing some. He had no one left but a beloved son. And he sent him last unto them, saying, they will receive my son. It doesn't take a lot of biblical exegesis and study to figure out Jesus' point here. The Old Testament prophets had been shamefully treated. Some were beaten, some were killed. Jeremiah was locked in a dungeon. Isaiah was sawed in half. Elijah had to flee from his life from Jezebel and Ahab. And you read the list of the Old Testament prophets, and it becomes very clear that they were frequently shamefully treated. And so Jesus kind of puts himself now in this lineage of Old Testament prophets, and saying that these Old Testament prophets, they were treated so shamefully. But Jesus draws this distinction in so much as he calls himself not so much a prophet, but actually the Son of God. Now, the landowner, in sending the son, has an expectation. And his expectation is that they would never mistreat the son the way they have the other servants. And so he does this with the hope that their behavior will be changed, amended, improved. But notice the response of the tenants. But the husbands said among themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours." Keep in mind the context here. Jesus has cleansed the temple. He has taken extreme umbrage with their transacting business and profiteering off of the temple. And this was something that the religious teachers were in cahoots with the various vendors on. And so they were part of the racketeering process and were garnering great wealth and exploiting people. And here, Jesus, in his parable, makes very clear that what motivates the tenants, what motivates their desire to kill the son, is they see him as a potential heir. And if they can bump off the heir, then they can keep all the goods and wealth to themselves. So it's a portrait of greed. It's a portrait of shameful destruction of human life for personal aggrandizement and benefit. And so, and again, the parable is sharply pointed at the religious teachers and leaders. Reading on, and they took him and killed him and cast him forth from the vineyard. What therefore will the Lord of the vineyard do? Will he come and destroy the husbandman and will give the vineyard unto others? Have you not read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders reject, the same was made the head of the corner, or the cornerstone. And this is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Jesus is casting his rejection, or I should say the rejection of him by the religious teachers in this profound light. The capstone or cornerstone was a key that held structures together. It was structurally important, integral, and necessary, essential. And here it is portrayed as being rejected. And so Jesus again is drawing upon this rich image to help them understand their rejection of him. So you have the capstone image and the vineyard image. And what they have, what those two examples and pictures have in common is there is, I don't want to put this, there is a mistreatment, or at the very least missing, of what's important. The builder misses the capstone. The tenants mistreat and miss how they should have treated the landowner's son. So there's some poor treatment of that which is essential and important and vital and valuable. And that's really how Jesus cuts into this. And again, using the cleansing of the temple as the background, the house of prayer for all the nations was the rich value of the temple under the Old Testament system and covenant that had been monetized, and therefore it had been devalued by the religious teachers and those who were merchants, the traders and sellers. They had found a great profit margin, but were profiting in second-rate things. And so Jesus is calling them out on this, challenging them on this very idea, which I might add they don't respond to well. Notice how it picks up now. And they sought to lay hold of him, and they feared the multitude, for they perceived that he spake in parables against them. And they left him and went away. So the thing that saves Jesus, I don't know if I want to say it that way, the thing that pushes Jesus' arrest further out and down the road is the crowd. And religious teachers out and outright fear probably a riot or insurrection if they were to arrest him publicly in the light of day in this moment. And so they're covering their tracks a little in by trying to subvert Jesus in more covert ways, as we'll see as this chapter unfolds. But notice that their intent is still the same. Their intent is to get an upper hand on him. And what's really fascinating is they sense the tone of Jesus' language. They sense the parable has been spoken against them. But the Bible stops short of saying that they actually understood the parable, just that they know it was against them. And that's a very fascinating thing, that they picked up the tone but didn't get the substance of the message. Anyways, knowing that the crowd would recoil negatively if they were to arrest him publicly, they went away. But notice that their reaction or response to all of this is not to give up but to double down. And so they sent to him a certain Pharisee, the Herodians, that they might catch him in talk. When they come, they said unto him, Teacher, we know that thou art true, and carest not for anyone, for thou regardest not the persons of men, but of truth teachest the way of God. Talk about buttering you up, man. I've always marveled at that passage when I've read it, at how incredibly transparent and how unbelievably evident is their attempt to flatter Jesus. And I can't help but imagine that if he didn't roll his eyes at all this flattery, if Jesus didn't roll his eyes, he had to be tempted to on some level. I mean, thou art true, thou teachest the way of God. You don't care what people have to say. You're like this great holy person. Well, that's all true, but the intent is malicious, so it's pretty pathetic, to say the least. So knowing that he's being buttered up, I think Jesus probably had his guard up as well. And here's the question they're going to level. Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Shall we give or shall we not give? Now, the reason this question is so tricky, it's so dicey to touch. It's a dicey question. And the reason it's so dicey is because if Jesus says, no, don't pay your taxes, he can be arrested on the spot by the Romans and killed, because he's essentially then an insurrectionist, a sedition. He's undermining the Roman Empire, and he's an enemy to the empire and to the emperor. And so there's that side. He's kind of hedged in there. However, if he says, yes, pay your taxes and support the Roman Empire, then he's alienating a good chunk of the Jewish people who abhorred the Roman Empire, and rightfully so. It was a pagan and godless organization, to say the least, one of the most brutal and inhumane governances to ever exist in human history. So who would want to be supportive of evil? And yet if he says, don't pay your taxes, he's guilty of leading an insurrection. So there's the rock and the hard place that they've tried to pin Jesus into. But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said unto them, Why make ye trial of me? Why do you put me on trial here? It's a great way to respond a question with a question. He questions them because he wants to open up a little bit about what motivates them. Obviously, Jesus felt put on the spot. His response conveys that. And usually when someone puts you on the spot, they're trying to leverage, control, manipulate, somehow force your hand one way or another. And so that's exactly what they're doing to Jesus. It's obvious, it's evident. And Jesus does a great job of just spinning it back on them and pushing back and saying, wait a second. Why are you putting me on the spot here? Why are you putting me on the spot? But he doesn't leave it there. In fact, he does follow up. Bring me a denarius, which is a great way. Jesus is so often a concrete teacher. And I, if I can say it this way, I envy his ability to teach so concretely, to be brutally honest. He can in a moment bring things down to earth so concretely, so clearly in this moment. He doesn't leave it this hypothetical, theoretical question of should we pay taxes or not. Instead, he goes after the very concrete mechanism by which you pay taxes. And he says, bring me the piece, the physical object, the piece of money, the silver, whatever, that you would bring to pay your taxes. Show me it. Show me it. And of course they do. They present him with a denarii, which was a common coin in the ancient world. And Jesus asks this wonderful question. Whose inscription is on this coin? And of course, it's Caesar's. And so what Jesus is able to do in this moment is to create this incredible line of distinction between between what really is of God's and what really is not of God's. And of course, minted coins are the product of a governance, and even that governance operates under the sovereignty of God. It's still just human governance. And so Jesus is able to establish the question on a higher plane. The question isn't, should we pay taxes or not? The question really is, who or what belongs to whom? Now, it's an interesting response given the parable he's just told. Because the parable of the vineyard is brokered on the principle that the landowner had a right to the produce. It wasn't that the landowner came out of the blue and asked for something he had no right to. He had a legitimate claim to that produce. It was grown on his land with his wine press and with his plants and with his water, with the well that he had dug, all that. He has a legitimate right to all that. And so for the tenants to behave that way was so unbelievably unjust. It was obvious. And so Jesus here points out something very important. And he says, whose inscription does this coin belong to? Whose is it? Whose image is this? Whose picture? Whose face is this? And they, well, that's Caesar's face. And he says, well, fine, then give it to Caesar. It's his. But then Jesus adds this important caveat. There are things that belong to God. And make sure that's rendered unto God. Now again, this is where the religious teachers had fallen incredibly flat. Incredibly flat. I mean, they had monetized worship of God. They had profiteering off of worship and the temple. And so they saw it not as a way to bless the nations and making it a house of prayer, a place where God and man could commune. They saw it as an opportunity to turn a dollar. And they abused the temple, and they abused their role as religious teachers to exploit others for their personal enrichment. And so Jesus is not just answering their question, he's also calling them out. He's bringing it back around and saying, now wait a minute, hold on here. This is about what belongs to whom. And they have robbed God. Robbed God. Consistently. No wonder Jesus felt so vehement anger in that scene where he tosses over the tables. He'd been stolen from. Repeatedly, systematically. By these people who were endowed with this tremendous responsibility. And not only they robbed him, they were going to now also kill him. So you sense the animus, but what's really fascinating is how quickly Jesus moves on his heels and on his feet, how quickly he can think on his feet and rebuff them. Notice that they're not done. Evil doesn't quit or give up, unfortunately, for humans. And so if the Pharisees are and I'll put this in political terms, if the Pharisees are the religious right of Judaism in the life of Jesus, and this question about paying taxes to Caesar was kind of the right hook, then they're going to send in the leftists, the more liberals, who in the time of Jesus politically were the Sadducees. And if the right hook didn't land a punch, then they're hoping to get him with the left hook. And so they come in with the Sadducees. Verse 18, I believe we were on. And he came to the Sadducees, who said that there is no resurrection. And they asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote unto us, if a man dies and leave a wife behind and have no child, his brother should take his wife and raise up an offspring, a seed, unto his brother. This is the idea of levirate marriage. It's an Old Testament command. It was the idea of preserving family lines, and in a culture where the most wealth was not mobile wealth. We live in a mobile wealth culture. You can go to a bank, pull out $1,000 in cash, you got that much in your bank account, or you can get that from someone else's account, I guess, if you're a thief. But you're taking wealth, and then it's mobile. You can transport it. You move it from here to there. In the ancient world, wealth was predominantly in the form of property or livestock, not so mobile like electronic transactions we see all the time in our culture. So wealth was in property. And if your inheritance was not passed on, it would leave certain segments of the population deeply impoverished, and it would lead to an excessive amount of wealth in some hands. And so there was this idea of an even distribution of property. Not an even distribution of wealth per se, but certainly an even distribution to the extent that it very much leveled the playing field and gave a lot of economic opportunity. It spread opportunity is what I'm getting at. In the ancient world, money and wealth often coalesced, even as it does in our modern society, in the hands of very few. You see the vast majority of people living in the time of Jesus were either peasants, slaves, indentured servants, or slaves. They had no economic freedom and very little economic opportunity. By contrast, you had the aristocracy and Caesar, and they were filthy rich, incredibly wealthy, in ways that are just even would baffle the modern mind. They're not millionaires, they're billionaires in our economy of thinking. And so to kind of level that playing field, God said family land should be inherited and passed down, and you could only sell your land for a season. And then there was this thing called the Year of Jubilee that occurred every 49th year, the seventh year, 49 years. And when that Year of Jubilee occurred, that wealth, that property, that land, real estate was to be returned to its original owner, so that there would never be the hoarding of wealth by a minority of people. It's a way to keep the system a little bit more equitable. So this levirate marriage thing seems really weird for us as 21st century Americans, and I get that, and it is, but it serves a very distinct cultural purpose of a society that lived 30,400 years ago. So, frame it that way, and it kind of helps you normalize it and kind of get why it existed. It was not some weird rule made up arbitrarily. It served a very definitive economic and inheritance type purpose. So that's the background for the Pharisees' question. Mark gives a little bit of a insight into the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection of the dead. That helps us to understand that when the Sadducees come and they pose this question, and I'll summarize it briefly for us, this question about one brother dying, and then the wife is given, the first brother is given to the second brother, who dies, and the third, and blah, blah. You can read it now as it's up on the screen. The point that Mark makes so evident is that given their theological assumptions, the Sadducees' theological assumptions, the question they're asking has no basis. It would be like me as a Protestant asking questions about purgatory. I don't have a theological basis because I don't believe in the inspiration of Maccabees and so forth and some of the apocryphal books of the intertestamental period. I don't have a theological basis for believing in purgatory. So I wouldn't come and ask a lot of questions about it, because I can't legitimize my questions given my theological assumptions. And that's the kind of thing that the Pharisees are doing here. They're asking a hypothetical question that is in no way supported by their theological assumptions. And so it's fascinating that Jesus is going to respond, but whereas he took the Pharisees more head on and gave a more direct answer, it wasn't the answer they expected, but it's more direct. Here he takes a very roundabout way of answering the question because he doesn't want to answer their hypothetical. He wants to get at their assumptions. Now, I'm getting a little more amped on this because this is such an important piece of understanding, not just the Old Testament, New Testament, but understanding human interaction in general. When you ask questions, you get people to work out, to open up about their assumptions. That's a phrase that the late Ravi Zacharias would use from time to time, and it's a great way of getting at this. When you ask questions, you get people to open up about their assumptions. If I were to say to you, do you own a red car? That's a pretty simple question. And if you do, you'd say yes. And if you did, you'd say no. But you are probably wondering, if I came up and asked you, do you own a red car? Your response would probably be something like, why do you want to know? It evokes that curiosity for us as human beings. And if I were to say, well, the lights are on, or your door is open, or something like that, or I noticed your front tire was low, something like that, I would then answer the question. But only if the person, only if you were to return the question and say, why do you ask? And then it forces me to open up and give more information and to explain and to justify my original question. So that's why questioning the questioner is so important. Not arguing with them, not trying to banter with them and get into a spitting match. It's a legitimate way to start to understand someone else's thinking. And so Jesus is going to spin this around. And he's going to not answer the question, but he's going to get at their assumption. They will end. In their resurrection, whose wife shall she be of them? For the 7 had her as a wife. Jesus said to them, it is not for this cause that ye err, that you know not the Scriptures, nor the power of God. In other words, Jesus' response to this, and I love how he phrases it, he goes, this question is not what's wrong with this whole thing. What's wrong with this whole thing is what you really think about God. You don't know the Scriptures, and you don't know the power of God. You've denied the inspiration of Scriptures, which the Sadducees had. They denied the supernatural power of God. Pharisees, by the way, are almost, I wouldn't want to say carbon copied today, but they are very prevalent. At least their theological assumptions live on in the mindset of many people living today. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Very much denies supernatural, very... anyways, I think you're probably getting the vibe I'm laying out, so I won't go any further. So, Jesus takes issue with their assumptions. You don't know God or the power of God. For when they shall rise from the dead, notice Jesus affirms the resurrection, taking issue with the core assumption of the Sadducees that there is no resurrection of the dead. Jesus says, when there is a resurrection of the dead, not if, when there's a resurrection of the dead, they're neither married nor given in marriage, whereas angels in heaven. The point that Jesus is making here is that you are asking this question about the resurrection of the dead as if human beings in eternal life are defined by these relationships that we know now. Husband and wife is the relationship of two people, between a male and a female, man and woman. It defines a covenantal agreement between these two people. And Jesus is simply saying that at the resurrection, we're not going to frame life that way. We're not going to frame our relationships with each other that way. And probably the more simplistic way to think about it is, we're not going to look at heaven and go, you're my husband and you're my wife. We're going to look at each other more as that we're brothers and sisters. There's a familial relational world that's there. But the husband-wife, father-mother dynamics don't really come into play in the relational patterns of which eternity are given to. So he pushes back about this. And then he goes one step further. And it's fascinating that he's not in this moment addressing the marriage question. He's not addressing that one. He's going back to their assumptions. But now on the dead, they are raised. Have you not read the book of Moses and the place concerning the bush, how God spoke unto them, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. In the Hebrew language, there are two tenses. We have three, they have two. Our English, past, present, future. In Hebrew, there is incomplete or completed action. And so you would either refer to something as past, or you would refer to something as more present and or future. So I would say in Hebrew, I have given you the study on Mark 11. That's completed action. I would say, I am giving you, I could put it in participle form, I am giving you the study on Mark chapter 12. And I can say that because it's not completed. But as soon as I click the end of this video and it's uploaded, then it would be completed action. Okay, so that's how the Hebrew mind works. There's completed or incomplete actions. Now, what's also interesting is when you talk about completed or incomplete actions, that applies also to life. There is in the category of the dead and the living. There are those who are passed on, those who are present. There's only two modes there. And they come out in how you tense your verbs. And when God spoke to Moses from the burning bush of Exodus, and Moses asked this question, what is your name? Who are you? And God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God in that moment does not say, I was the God of Abraham. Notice he doesn't invoke a past tense. He is still in that moment at the burning bush, the God of people who have been dead for 400 years plus. The relationship between God and his people hasn't changed. The relationship among them, as far as them being husbands and wives, that gets reworked in eternity. But the relationship that eternity centers around is not who we're married to, but it is who is our God. And because there is a resurrection of the dead, God could not describe himself as the God past tense of these people, as if it were completed action. No, he is still the God of these people because they will be resurrected. He is not done being their God, even though they're dead, because they will be resurrected. If you can follow that, you can get the intricacies of the argument Jesus is making. And unfortunately in English it comes out kind of kooky because we're missing some very important details, but that's the gist of it based upon the language of the Old Testament that the Pharisees and Jesus are now bantering about. Okay? So Jesus is emphatically talking about the resurrection of the dead. States it. There will be a resurrection of the dead. At that point, we will not be defined by husband-wife relationships. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob still are the children of God. And God is not done being their God. It's an incomplete action because of the resurrection of the dead. Over and over again, Jesus hammers their theological mess. Resurrection of the dead. Resurrection of the dead. Who cares about who's husband and wife? We got to get back to the basics here, and that is there is life beyond the grave. And why is Jesus fighting so emphatically? Because his time of execution is so close. And if he doesn't take issue with this idea of the resurrection of the dead, his whole message, his whole gospel, everything falls apart. And if you don't believe me, read Mark in the New Testament, or excuse me, Paul in the New Testament. Paul gets on this very point. He says, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, our faith is useless and in vain. Resurrection of the dead is not a sidelight to the Christian faith. It is the miracle that affirms the teachings of Jesus. It is the miracle that forms the centre of our hope and of a future and an eternity with God. It isn't just something. It is the thing that matters. And so it's not up for grabs. And so he doubles down and hammers on this point. So, moving forward. I'm taking up too much time, sorry, but we'll keep moving. He's not the God of the living dead. One of the scribes came, and they heard them questioning together, knowing that he had answered them well, asked him, what commandment is the first of all? First here in Greek, first either means in order of sequence, like first in line, or it means first of importance. And here, very clearly, it is the issue of importance that he implies with the question. Not what was the first spoken commandment chronologically, but in the hierarchy of question or hierarchy of commands that God has given. What is the guiding light? What's the big one? What is the central? What's the glue that holds it all together? If you put all the commandments of God in a pyramid, what's at the pinnacle of that pyramid? What's the big one? This was a question that was hotly debated in the day in which Jesus lived. This was their theological hot button issue, well, besides the resurrection of the dead, but this was another one. And it should be noted this scribe just kind of comes along. He doesn't seem like he was a setup man sent by the Pharisees like the Sadducees and Pharisees were. Sorry, set up by the religious teachers, I should say. Just happens to be there. And he listens to Jesus, and he recognizes how sound Jesus' teaching is. And so I think of this guy as very different than the first couple groups. I see this one as someone who's like, he sees somebody who he can have a real discussion with, a real dialogue with about these deep issues. And so he asks this question, this big picture, very important question. What's the most important law of the Old Testament? That's not a small question. That's a big question. It's a good question. And Jesus answered. The first is, "Hear, O Israel." He quotes the Shema out of Deuteronomy, I believe it's chapter 6, verse 4. Shemaru Israel, Israel Ichad. Hear, O Israel. There's just one God. It is the monos. I'm going to get this wrong. Monotheistic. I want to say something else. Different mono. Monotheistic creed of the Old Testament. Again, polytheism is the rule of most pagan forms of worship. Certainly in the Old Testament world, certainly in the time of Jesus, you're looking at the time of the Greek gods and so forth. There's a plethora of gods and so forth, was the normative teaching. But this statement given by Moses becomes the bedrock, the anchoring point for Judaism for 1,400 years. It's a really long time, by the way, 1,400 years. Orthodox Jews would repeat the Shema. They would teach this as the first passage of Scripture that children would memorize. So this is their John 3:16 of the ancient world. This was the verse that everybody knew. If you went up to someone on the streets and you said, "Quote me a verse of the Old Testament," they would probably start with the Shema. Hear, O Israel. It states emphatically the monotheistic nature of God. The Lord is one. And then it states, of course, how we are to respond to that one singular God. We are to love that God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, with all thy strength. The point being, all of us. It invokes a all-encompassing term. And again, in Jewish language, Hebrew language, you don't have a lot of adjectives. You don't have words like everything. So you had to kind of list the big ones. And so what are we made of? We're made of heart, soul, mind, and strength. This means everything. Love God with everything. Jesus then piggybacks on it, and he draws the logical connection. We cannot treat people like trash and say we love God. They are interconnected. We must love God foremost. And then Jesus attaches to that, we love our neighbor as ourselves. These are the greatest commandments. Now, Jesus does not question the questioner here. He doesn't say to him, to this scribe, "Hey, how do we know that there is a hierarchy in the law? How do we know there is one command at the top?" Been a great counter question. But Jesus takes the question at face value and he answers it, which tells us what? There is a hierarchy in the order of importance of God's law. There is, if you will, a summary statement. And the summary statement of the Old Testament isn't, go do this and this. The summary statement of the Old Testament is, love God. And then the application of that is to love thy neighbor. And then you can boil all the Old Testament commandments, particularly the ethical pieces of the Decalogue of the Ten Commandments, into those categories. The first three are about loving God, not making other gods, having no other images, not taking the Lord's name in vain, etc. Remembering the Sabbath to keep it holy, that we would spend time and live and dwell with God. And then the rest are the ethical implications of what it means to love my neighbor. It means to be submissive unto my parental authority. I can't say I love my neighbor and hate my parents. They're one of my neighbors. I can't say I love my neighbor and steal their wife or their manservant, their maidservant, their cattle, their possessions. There has to be property rights and respect of personal property. Has to be. And of course, we can't lie and bear false witness and get people put in jail or killed or stoned because it's convenient, and we corrupt justice that way. So those commandments, particularly the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments really serve as a chapter heading, because then Moses explains and gives detail to each of those commands, are rooted in this idea that we love God and love our neighbor. So there's this system. It's never stated in a explicit way. It's not like here's rule number 1 and here's all the subpoints in rule number 1, and here's number 2 and all the subpoints. But when you read the Old Testament law and you actually study and spend some time there, you realize there is a reason to the madness. There's a system there, and it comes out as you study and as you read it, and you become familiarized with it. And Jesus highlights that and says, this is what matters. This is what's important. And the scribe said to him, of a truth, teacher, thou hast said well. I love that phrase. You nailed it, Jesus. There's another but he. To love him with all our heart and with all our understanding, with all our strength, and to love his neighbor as himself is much more than a whole lot of burnt offerings and sacrifices. That's my paraphrases. When Jesus answered discreetly, he said unto him, thou art not far from the kingdom of God. The Pharisees and Sadducees are clueless and in trouble and bent on destroying Christ. This is an honest, sincere guy who's asking the question, and when he sees truth, acknowledges it as truth. And it's interesting that Jesus' response to the person is to tell him, you're not far from the kingdom of God. The heart of a kingdom follower of Christ is one that wants to know the truth and wants to love God and wants to love his neighbor. And after this, no man asked him any questions. So that's when we get the quiet out of the crowd. And Jesus answered and said, as he taught in the temple, how say the scribes that the Christ is the son of David? When David said of himself, and the Holy Spirit, that the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand, till I make thine enemies a footstool of thy feet. David himself calleth him Lord. And whence he is his son? So Jesus, knowing that he's put his accusers, attackers on defense, decides to take a little moment to play offense. And he asks them a question, a great question. And simply put, in the Old Testament world and in even the time of Jesus, a parent would never say to their child, Lord. But yet David, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, says unto the Lord that his heir should sit at his right hand till thy footstools are an enemy. Of course, that heir is by definition his son. It might be his great, whatever, how many great grandsons. But in the culture, you would never frame a son or a grandson or any heir of yours, anyone from your who descended from you, would never call them a lord. That would be illegitimate. So Jesus asks this question, how can that be? That David, by inspiration of the Spirit, would call his descendant a lord. And the common people responded with him gladly. In his teaching, he said, beware of the scribes, who desire to walk in long robes and have salutations in the marketplace, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and chief place at the feast. They devour the houses of widows, and for penance make long prayers. He shall receive greater commendation. He sat down over against the treasury, and beheld how the multitude cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. There came a widow, and she cast in 2 mites, which make a farthing. This is good King James language, by the way. It's basically 2 copper coins. The 2 coins together amount to a penny. And he called unto his disciples, and he said to them, verily I say unto you, this poor woman cast more than they are casting into the treasury, for they cast out of their superfluity. I can't even say that word right now. I'll try later. But she, of her want, did cast in all she had, even all her living. In other words, Jesus is saying what? He's talking about that wholehearted love for God, is he not? He's bringing a physical description. Again, keep in mind that Jesus is a master teacher, not because of his words, but because of his word pictures. And so he's not trying to coin cool phrases. He's simply looking around him and saying, how can I illustrate this in a way that people will understand it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Great law, pinnacle of Judaism. What does it look like? In real life, what does it look like? And of course, they're in the temple, and there's people praying, there's people doing all kinds of stuff. Jesus takes them over to the treasury. Why money? Because that's been a big piece of contention between himself and the Pharisees and religious teachers. They were profiteering, and he was appalled by it because they so corrupted the temple. And he shows them this widow. He says, there's a picture of someone who loves God. She was probably poorly dressed. She was probably very inconspicuous. The fact that she's a female in a very sexist society would not have been overlooked either. And Jesus says, there's a picture of someone who loves God. Why? Because the great quantity of wealth that they gave? That would have been probably the human assumption, to listen and say, wow, there's someone who, when they threw their money in, man, there was a lot of cha-ching going on. That person loved God because of their great quantity. That would be a human response, but God's judgment is so different. God looks at a more qualitative look at this thing. Not how much did you give, but what did you give out of? And this woman gives out of her poverty. She gives out of what she would have had to live on. She gives out of her full-hearted devotion to God. It's a beautiful picture of what it means to love God. Above all else, to love him, heart, soul, mind, and strength. As I try to bring this to a close, and I know I've gone way over time, and I apologize for that, but it's very dense, and I mean that in the positive sense of the word, very dense writing by Mark. There's this constant philosophical or abstract statements, and then there's these dovetailed, connecting, physical ideals, pictures, and examples. And so the parable of the tenants, the physical example is, of course, the Pharisees who are going to kill Jesus because they want everything and they're greedy. There's as I said here at the end, this woman who gives out of her poor, out of what she has, all that she has. Jesus says, what's the highest command? To love God. And here's a woman who shows a profound demonstration of what that looks like. It's not that should be the normative, that everyone's supposed to go out and do this. But Jesus just simply says, there's a picture of it. There's an example of it. You don't need to look any further than this inconspicuous, poor woman. I want to encourage you that when you study this portion of Scripture, make sure you're grabbing hold of those two realities, the abstract and philosophical pieces, the big picture, abstract ideas that are floating back and forth as Jesus has incredibly profound interactions with some of the brightest minds in the Jewish world at this time in history, who are well learned, well versed, knew the Old Testament far better than I would have, can quote old passages, whole books of the Old Testament out of their memories. This rich dialogue, and how Jesus constantly works in these beautiful pictures that bring life and flesh out those ideals. If you can do that as you read this particular section of Mark, and even, if I'm recalling correctly, into the next chapter as well, you're going to grab hold of it, and it's going to be rich, and it's going to be vivid, and it's going to be very powerful. And I would encourage you to just let God's word speak to you about these things. And you're going to find that he has a lot to say in these chapters. And I hope I brought some of that to life for you, and I hope it spurs your thinking and encourages you in your learning. If you have questions or thoughts, things I didn't address in this YouTube lesson, please let me know. I'm always happy to answer questions. It sharpens my thinking too. So I encourage you to throw those out there. And hopefully in the weeks to come, I'm able to increase the amount of visual aids and other things I'm putting out here so that Like I said, you're not just sitting and staring at me for an hour, which probably gets really boring at this point. So, but yes, be encouraged, keep growing, keep learning. And as always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to send them my way. Praying for God's blessings on you all, and may God come alive as you study this story of his love and grace in Mark.